You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show. Hey everyone, Open Source Summit, heart of Europe, and we're here with the General Manager of Linux Foundation Europe and Executive Director of FinOS, which is the financial, what does it stand for again?
FinTech Open Source Foundation.
FinTech Open Source Foundation, Gabriel Colombo.
Perfect. That was good pronunciation, man.
Thank you very much. You know, I worked on it a little bit. Just read the
Thanks for having me here, Alex.
Yeah, you bet. So Gabriel, one of the topics I want to discuss is like, you got to help me out here, because yesterday I heard y'all like talking about the danger of the cyber resiliency act and the existential threat that it has to open source. Today, we heard Jim Zemlin, the executive director of the Linux Foundation, say that these are sunny times, and talked about forks and how forks are healthy, and that's when Open Tofu came up as a discussion.
Yep.
So help me out here. I'm noticing a little bit like dun 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 kind of like feeling on day one, like fight, we gotta fight. And then next 7 days, like hey, everything's cool.
It's a very good point. I would say the truth is always in the middle.
Yes.
Meaning, I don't know that I would portray the Cyber Resilience Act as necessary and as essential threat for open source at large, but certainly, especially as far as Europe is concerned, and I am, both an Italian citizen and the general manager of LF Europe, it certainly risks to, upend the way we know open source in Europe, particularly. Because, despite having very, very worthy goals, we're very supportive of accelerating the process, even by regulation, of cybersecurity, the understanding that cybersecurity is national security and the most critical pieces of infrastructure are at risk. I think due to improper understanding of how the software supply chain works and how much is reliant on open source, it risks catching open source in the middle. And so, I think Jim is right. It is actually, on a global basis, a pretty exciting time to be in open source. But the Cyber Resilience Act, and I'm happy to go more in the specifics, the way it's drafted, it does risk to basically cut out Europe out of the global open source ecosystem.
That's pretty scary when you think about it. I mean, and if you cut out Europe, then you are damaging other parts of the world too.
There definitely can be a knock-on effect, but look, we call the community to act on this because ultimately it's the European developers, small and medium businesses, and just in general the industrial open source, the industrial community that depends so much in open source that will, potentially pay a pretty steep price if this goes through.
So if I'm just going to sum this up, so I listened to you yesterday, and you say, this is, you're not happy with this legislation.
Yep.
You would like to see it much different than it is.
Yep.
And we can get into the reasons for that.
Yep.
But on the other hand, Jim is talking about, hey, this is a sign of a healthy open source world out there.
Yep.
Now, so I see that kind of like difference in like how these two kind of like points of view on each day kind of sum up to something that is a little bit more contextual. Now, can you then just help me understand what this is from that the Cyber Resilience Act would enforce as a mandate for open source developers?
Yeah. So earlier in the year, we published an open letter with all the other open source foundations out there to really ensure that there will be enough consultation with the open source community. Something that has increased since then, but has not been, I would say, as effective and as we would want it to be. So, in the earlier drafts of the CRA, there were potential liability for individual developers, foundations, and potentially package managers. So the very fabric of open source, you know, basically in the assumption that the liability of sort of compliant or the conformance requirements would be sort of shared across the whole supply chain. Now, as we evolved, and the law is not final; it's entering trilogues. So, EU Council, Parliament, and Commission working together on a final draft. There are certainly some drafts that are better than others. I would say where we stand right now is individual developers are likely not going to be liable unless they're having recurrent donations from commercial companies, which is kind of what we're trying to solve for open source sustainability. If you think about it, the idea of paying maintainers is what we've been trying to raise, awareness of after Log4Shell last year, and the whole issue of sort of supply chain security. So I think from a individual developer standpoint, the draft currently looks better than it did. For package managers, the GitHubs of the world, the NPMs of the world, the Maven Centrals of the world, things are looking a little better in the latest drafts. Right now, there is, I think, a big concern that foundations, because in fact we do, through our membership, accept recurring donations from commercial companies, we would have sort of liability to basically stamp open source projects with the CE mark, the European Union mark of conformance. And look, this is particularly, I think, threatening for the smaller foundations that might not have resources to put together the currently undefined but probably quite onerous security processes to actually have a badge of conformance with the CRA. And I would also argue that this is not something that again, smaller and medium enterprises in Europe can, take care of. And so, again, I think when I see the major problem that I see here is that on one hand, Europe is very big on open source, and the European Union is pushing open source as a vehicle for digital sovereignty, for a next generation internet. But on the other hand, through this legislation, it might really hamper the open source value exchange as we know it. It's going to create potential incentives for people not to open source projects because they're scared of liability, or to not allow projects to be downloaded in Europe until we know, in a couple of years, how the legislation is properly implemented. There's probably going to be lawsuits where it gets tested in court and then adjudicated. So, it creates a big factor of risk, or at minimum, an unknown gray area.
So those are all what ifs, though.
Yep.
Right? And so we don't know.
We don't know.
And often with laws, nothing really happens after the law changes. You don't really know anything until 5 or 10 years down the road.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's that. How did it get to this point?
I would say a combination of two things. On one hand, open source communities are not pyramidal organizations. We are not corporates. We're not structured with public affairs departments working in Brussels or in the political back channels, if that makes sense. But also, open source foundations cannot speak on behalf of the whole community. Open source communities are very distributed communities made of individuals, corporates, and public sector increasingly. And so it's really hard to represent a unified position, even within, Linux Foundation being one of the largest foundations out there. We cannot speak on behalf of every single contributor that worked for our projects, let alone across foundations. So I think one point is, open source foundations are not lobbying organizations. And I think what we learned this year is that we need to be more cohesive in the way we work with policymakers. And you've seen, again, open letters signed by major foundations. The Linux Foundation hosted an open source congress in July in Geneva to bring together all the leaders of the foundations to try and really work on common issues. So that's on one side. I think on the EU side, and Linux Foundation Europe has only been launched a year ago. So, probably if we were here for a couple of years, we probably could have been ahead of the game, but we certainly got involved late in the process. Probably this is a legislation that has been discussed now for a year or two. But I have not seen sort of that proactive outreach from the European Commission in terms of bringing open source communities and foundations as a first-class citizen in the consultations that led to this legislation. And
So what do you know about who consulted them?
What do you mean?
Well, they had to get the idea somewhere.
Well, I would assume, this is pure speculation, but again, it probably followed the standard legislation process. I'm sure they've had conversations with the different industrial groups, with the different, standard organizations, sort of your typical organizations that are more structured in Brussels. But I want to kind of make a parallel here. I'm not sure if you saw last week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about how OpenSSF, our Open Source Security Foundation, was at the White House hosting an open source supply chain security summit together with, technology vendors like Google, and some of the, big banks, that I work with in my Finos hat. The CISO of JP Morgan was there, the city was represented there. So in a way, and it pains me as an Italian to say that, but I think that the White House is doing a much better job at understanding that foundations and open source communities are first-class citizens of the global software supply chain.
Hi all, Alex Williams here, giving a little plug for Cloud Native Rejects in Chicago, Illinois on November 4th and 5th, just before KubeCon. Cloud Native Rejects is the B-side conference for all those wonderful talks that were rejected at KubeCon. So check out Cloud Native Rejects November 4th and 5th in Chicago, just before the big KubeCon event. Register at eventbrite.com. So I'm just trying to understand, where did they get their idea for this, I guess, industry consortiums? And a lot of things I hear from people around here like saying, oh, they don't understand. But then when I hear people say, oh, they don't understand, I'm thinking, well, why don't they understand?
I think that's pretty simplistic to say that they don't understand. I would say, I always start from what could have we done better, and I think we need to do a better job, for example, at explaining the difference between open source and open governance. I think open source is very well defined right now because, it's maintained by the OSI, there is an open source definition. I think the concept of open governance is a little bit more amorphous in the sense that how do you define a project that on top of having an open source license is also not under the single control of any company? Meaning, we've seen with the HashiCorp side of the house.
Yeah.
Terraform is open source, but it's clearly not openly governed. It's what you would refer as a single vendor open source, where a vendor has the full copyright, the trademark, and all sort of the legal instruments to then potentially change a license. Interestingly, I think the same issue is what sort of permeates in the CRA. This is not about excluding or including open source from liability. It's about projects that, whether they're open source or proprietary, are managed and owned by a single vendor, should be liable, and that vendor should be liable.
Okay.
When you actually have an open governance around that project where multiple organizations participate and contribute, and none of them have full control, then you can't put the liability on the open source project, but it has to be put at the moment that project gets embedded, sold, and put into the market. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what are you asking people to do, and how much time is left? Because as I understand, this is going to go into law, not in the next week, but it's on a track to go into law.
Yeah. in terms of the legislative process, we expect the next step to be the trilogues. That's where the three different bodies, European Council, European Parliament, and European Commission, are going to merge their drafts into a final proposal. And then it's very likely that a vote in the plenary of the European Parliament, which is the final step, is supposed to happen later in the year. Bear in mind that there are elections, European elections, in April next year. So I'm pretty sure that if you think about sort of the geopolitics of the war in Ukraine and how much sort of cybersecurity and national security, has been at the forefront of the news, there's probably certainly pressure to get something out before the end of this legislation. So in terms of timing, we're talking, right now. We're talking the next couple of months. What we are asking folks and what we launched yesterday, they fixed the CRA campaign. It's truly to, first of all, educate yourself and understand what's happening and what are the liabilities that you potentially have, whether you're an individual, a small and medium business, or a foundation, for example. And so the Linux Foundation has put out, we have a landing page with a lot of explainer information in there that it's, unbiased, we think, and it just really tries to make people understand what's coming. When I asked yesterday during my keynote, probably 30-40% of the people raised their hands in terms of even knowing what the CRA is, let alone what the impacts for them is. And then secondly, be vocal, whether that is through, social networks or, if you're a business, probably you have a public affairs department. And whether you're working in Brussels or through your own national government, make sure that they are educated on, first of all, how much your company depends on open source, and secondly, what the risks of open source are.
What does this mean for the LF Europe? I know that you're doing a lot, and I know you spend a lot of time in North America. And you spend a lot of time here. I mean, I don't know where you live, but
California.
Okay, so do you need people in Brussels?
We actually,
or do you need to be in Brussels?
I have been in Brussels quite a bit. But bear in mind, we're not a lobbying organization, both by sort of tax code and by mandate.
Yeah.
So we educate, and I have to say that honestly, again, the European Commission, we have a really good relationship with the European Union. They really look up at what foundations and in general open source has done for Europe and what it can do for Europe. So
can you have industry consortiums work on your behalf? I mean, the telecommunications industry is huge, and they're much more involved in the LF now. And my bet is that they have their people who are talking to the people in the European Commission.
So I think you're absolutely right that there are, we've been working with our members to make sure that they are very much educated in this and that they sort of have their, public. We wanted to make sure that there is consistency across, to the point that I was making before. We have thousands of members. We have, hundreds of thousands of contributors. We cannot impose our interpretation on them, but certainly having a consistent message when it comes back, that's really important, because ultimately, EU, as I was saying in my keynote yesterday, is very reliant on the strong industrial players in the different areas of telcos, healthcare, automotive. There's a lot of excellence here, and so that's certainly the ones that are going to have a big impact. I would say the other area where we all foundations work together is under the auspices of Open Forum Europe. Open Forum Europe is a think tank based in Brussels that really advocates for open technologies, and they've done a fantastic job over the last year to,
So if I was going to write a letter today, saying, "Don't do this, people. Parliament of Europe, this is not a good thing. You have wonderful, growth in your European economy, and software developers are underrepresented, but they're there, and they make it possible for people to have good restaurants and whatever it is, right?" Who would I write that letter to?
Well, there are a couple of, I think, key people. As I said, it's pretty complex because you have the council, which is the representative of the different nations.
So what would I research? I research like, I probably will have to pick and choose and maybe have to write multiple letters.
From the parliament time, it would probably be Nicola Dante, who's the main rapporteur from the parliament.
Nicola Dante, if you're out there listening to the new stack makers, you may get some letters.
That's absolutely possible.
It's absolutely possible. Does he have a Twitter address?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. How do you spell his name?
Nicola Dante.
Dante, like Dante.
D-A-N-T-I.
Oh, not E. Well, okay.
Yeah, my fellow Italian.
Okay, good. Well, I think I'm going to end it there. Nicola Dante, we'll end it with a Nicola Dante.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.